So you done your masters in which subject?
I did my masters in Judaism and Christianity in the Greco-Roman world.
Okay, great. So just off the back of the last discussion, we were talking about the Bible and the authorship, and if we cannot know who the authors of certain books are, how then can we have certainty that their theology is correct? So I wanted to continue up the last conversation. The first discussion I'd like to have is the literacy rates. I wanted to know, in ancient Palestine, or the region that we're discussing, Bart Ehrman, he authors the book Forged, and he talks about the literacy rates in this area. He quotes two scholars, Harris and Hessler, one being a professor of ancient history in Columbus University or Columbia University, one of the two. And they make mention that the literacy rates in that region would have been as low as 3%. So the only people that would have been writing were people who were scribes of high class and so on and so forth. So I just want to ask, according to Acts, you have the Bible there, could we go to Acts 4?
Yeah, sure thing.
Yeah, sure. Because at the moment the topic is about literacy rates, so we want to know about the authorship of the Bible. Now if we look at Acts 4 verse 13.
Your voice is out?
Yeah, please.
So Acts 4:13. Now when they, that is the Jewish authorities, saw the boldness of Peter and John and realised that they were uneducated and ordinary men, they were amazed and recognised them as companions of Jesus.
Okay, you said you read the Greek.
Yes,
okay,
broadly speaking.
Broadly speaking, yes. So agrammatoi.
Okay.
Agrammatoi.
Unlettered, literally.
Unlettered.
Unlettered, yeah.
So these two were referred to as unlettered. Did these two ever author any books in the Bible?
We believe they did. So we believe that the traditional belief is that this John wrote both the Gospel of John and the 3 letters of John, and then also the book of Revelation as well, and that Peter obviously wrote 1st and 2nd Peter. So that's the traditional belief.
Okay, you're aware of the forgery that was rife in that region. I think Galen, he makes mentions that libraries at that time were eager to get original copies of any text, such as Socrates, Hippocrates, or any of these philosophers. They were eager to get the original copies. So what happened, they were paying a lot of money for these original copies. And what happened was, a lot of forgeries started popping up. You can imagine why, because there was so much money being offered for the original. Now everyone has a most motivation and intention when they make manuscripts or when they forge. Now this is the topic of Bart Ehrman's book Forged. This is what I want to get into. So we've explained the literacy rates in the area was low.
So I actually wanted a chance to respond to that.
Yeah, sure.
So you're right. There is that study by a couple of scholars which suggests it's as low as 3% or so. I think there's at least one other study suggesting it could be higher, particularly in Jewish communities where Jewish boys might be taught to read the Torah when they're young. I don't know much about that. I just know there's a bit of a debate that's going on.
And what are the names of the two disciples here that were referred to as unlettered?
This was Peter and John referred to in Acts chapter 4 verse 13.
And they have books underneath their names, though they're unlettered.
That is correct, yes.
And what would your explanation be? If they cannot write nor read, how then did they become the authors of certain books? 2
points I would want to make. One is, what do we mean by agrammatoi? Obviously the way the NRSV has translated it is not illiterate but uneducated. The issue here is that Peter and John are humble folk who have come before the very learned Jewish authorities who would not just know how to read and write, they know all about Jewish law. So the matter here by no means is whether or not they can read or write in a very basic sense, it's do they have the rabbinical training. So I wouldn't necessarily use this text as proof that they couldn't read or write, even if they couldn't read or write, or they couldn't do it to a high level. As one scholar has noted humorously, illiteracy is a curable disease. Even at this point in time, which is probably within a year or two of the crucifixion. I have to check the chronology. That's very early on. Traditionally, the dates for the books in the New Testament were often talking, 10, 15, sometimes 40 years, maybe more, even later than the time of the crucifixion of Jesus. So during that long period of time, given sufficient motivation, such as the motivation to spread the gospel through the written form, could they have learned to write? Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay, since we're on the topic of motivation and spreading the word, one of the issues that I think it was Plato, let me just double check. Oh, okay. One of the topics that Plato mentioned was something called the medicinal lie.
Okay.
You may have heard it because Clement and Origen also agreed with this kind of philosophy. The philosophy was that if I were to lie in order to get my patient to take medicine, then I have made a justified lie. Now it's clear some of the church fathers, as mentioned, Origen and who did I mention? Origen and Clement, of Alexandria. They agreed with this concept. And you can see this, the justification is also taken from the Bible when Abraham lied about his relation with his wife in order to escape persecution. There's further justification. You can see Paul where he says, if by my lie the truth is abounded, then why do you judge as me as a sinner? So there's this concept of the medicinal lie. Outside of the Gospels, we have several writings by Paul, or that claim to be by Paul, but they're not actually by Paul. Now, I'm sure you do know actually.
So Third Clement, for example. Oh, sorry, that's Clement. Sorry, what am I on about? That's Clement. Third Corinthians. Sorry, Third Corinthians.
Just before we get onto that, outside of the Bible, there's some books. For example, Paul, he writes to the major scholar of that time in philosophy, Cyrenaica.
Okay.
Now Cyrenaica, he did not mention Christianity or Paul at all. So 14 letters between Paul and this major philosopher were forged in order to bring some kind of substance to Christian theology. Now, what do you think of this? Do you agree with the medicinal lie kind of concept where these letters are forged outside of the Testament in order to make Paul's theology seem strong?
Yes, so that certainly happened. There certainly were Christian forgeries. That I cannot deny.
Okay, but there was 14 letters and there's much more, as you know.
Yes, so there were lots of early Christian forgeries, yes.
So this is known and is often thought to be something which is good. So in the Testament, how many books do we have that are written by Paul?
In the New Testament we have it. I think it's 13.
That's right, 13.
A bit of a debate what you think of Hebrews, but yeah, around 13.
Yeah, there's around 13. Of those, how many are attested actually to be of Paul's?
What do you mean by that, sorry?
Well, scholars generally say that 7 of these.
What do scholars generally accept to be?
Yeah, 7 of them are authentic. They're attributed to him.
That sounds about right. Yeah, 7 kind of widely agrees with authentic, and then the others debated.
The others are debated. Why do you think they're
more or
debated?
less levels. Why are they debated? 2 main reasons. I mean, one is methodology, the other is worldview. In terms of methodology, why certain books are debated. Some books of Paul have a different style. Some see conflicting theologies with them. Some might appeal to manuscript evidence being different. Some note that the early church had disputes over certain books. So there are all sorts of factors why some scholars reject certain books as being authentically Pauline. Just to carry on, I mean, and in terms of why they do that, I think within the West, since the Enlightenment, modern New Testament studies, to some extent hermeneutic of suspicion, there is a very critical attitude to many of these texts, which is not a bad thing, and that is what has raised all sorts of questions, yes.
So if there's debate about the theology in that book, can we say that's not 100% consistent with each other?
It's not 100% clear that it is consistent.
Okay, for example, in Thessalonians 1 and 2. Now these are books which are claimed to be written by Paul. In Thessalonians 1, we have, if you just open up the Bible to Thessalonians 4, verse 17.
Sorry, 1 Thessalonians 4.
4:17.
Then we who are alive, who are left, will be caught up in the clouds together with them to meet the Lord in the air. So we will be with the Lord forever.
That's it. So it was common belief at that time when Paul was writing to the Thessalonians that the return of Jesus would be in the lifetime of these persons. This is the general backdrop of that story.
I do disagree that is what Paul is saying in the New Testament. The way I
just the letter to the Thessalonians.
So it's saying we who are alive.
Yeah.
Does that necessarily mean we, all of the Christians now living, we will still be alive when the Lord returns? Or does it mean we, the body of Christ, when the Lord returns, we will be caught up? Yeah.
Okay.
You can read it either way.
Usually, this is a letter which is written to the people.
Thessalonica.
Yeah. So these people are being addressed. So when it says we, I don't think it means the body of Gentiles and non-Christians. I think it was a letter just to them, saying that Jesus will come in their lifetime.
So very often Paul writes occasional letters. They are letters to particular churches in particular circumstances. But in addressing particular circumstances, he very often refers to broader themes, broader theologies. I think that's what he's doing here. He is saying there's an immediate issue here. There's maybe some debate about when the end times will be, or moral behaviour before then, whatever the issue is in Thessalonians. Let's apply the general Christian principle, which is the Lord is returning, and this is what will happen to the believers. So a general application applies to a specific situation, but that doesn't mean he expects the Lord necessarily to return in the Thessalonians.
Okay, sure. So if we go to chapter 5, verse 2.
For you yourselves know very well that the day of the Lord will come like a thief in the night.
So I think the general concept was, from what scholarship had said, you may disagree with certain things, is that the return of Jesus was at least expected in the lifetime of certain people.
A lot of scholars will say that.
And it would be a sudden arrival, like a thief in the night. Now if we go to Thessalonians 2, which is also claimed to be written by Paul, there's a slightly different kind of theology. If you go to 2:2, if you read 2:2,
not to be quickly shaken in mind or alarmed, either by spirit or by word or by letter, as though from us, to the effect that the day of the Lord is already here.
What does it mean, as though from us?
So they seem to
Could
have...
I just give a backdrop to this? The backdrop here is here. The same people that were expecting Jesus to return in their lifetime has started dying. Now, because Jesus' arrival hasn't come, they started getting worried. What's happened to this letter that you mentioned in the first instance? Now, if we read here, it says more or less the inaccuracy that was acclaimed to have been written by us. Now, what do you think it's referring to?
So it is not necessarily referring to a letter. It's saying, do not be shaken, either by spirit or by word or by letter. It's saying, wherever you've heard this idea, don't think that the day of the Lord is already here. So it's not necessarily referring to any particular letter. It could be from a letter, might not be. Paul is saying, wherever you've got it, don't think like that.
Okay, if you could just look at 2:3, the next verse.
Let no one deceive you in any way, for that day, the day of the Lord, will not come unless the rebellion comes first and the lawless ones revealed, the one destined for destruction.
Okay, so now we've got more of a context. If I give you the backdrop, what happened was the first letter was written to them. This is attributed to Paul. The second letter is misattributed to Paul, and these are the evidences which the scholars discuss. In the first Thessalonians, it describes Jesus' coming as imminent, sudden, and in the lifetime of these people. So then what happened? These people started dying, so then it needed to be addressed. So here, the author, who claims to be Paul, says, do not be deceived by the first letter as if by us. So it's some of the scholars, they say that this as by us is in reference to the first letter. And it then explains that the return of Jesus is not imminent. It would only happen after a series of events will take place. So for this reason, that the scholars, they generally think that this letter is a forgery. What would you say in regards to this, whether if it's a forgery?
So I've already explained, I don't think it's necessarily in response to the first letter. I mean, Paul says it could be by spirit, by word, or by letter. So he's saying, I'm not sure where you've heard this, but let me set the record straight. Generally, I mean, we kind of touched upon this before when I gave you my interpretation of 1 Thessalonians. I don't see a contradiction between the two. I think what 1 Thessalonians talks about is, I partly agree with what you said. There is an imminency. The Lord is at hand. The Lord could come at any time, but that doesn't mean he's necessarily going to come in this lifetime. Could be any time. Always be ready. That's what Jesus talks about. But Jesus also says, but there could be a bit of time. So
don't you think
generally, just to explain my general New Testament eschatology, because it might be different from some other Christians, and it could speed up, kind of help the proceedings. So generally, I'm what's called a preterist. So I think that some of the eschatological statements in the New Testament do refer to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 and the events prior to that. So in some sense, that was within their generation, that was immediate, but that some of the eschatological descriptions referring to the final judgment, that has the language of imminency, could happen at any time, but still non-committal in that we don't know when it is. So that's my eschatological understanding.
Okay, since you mentioned about the destruction of Jerusalem, just for our listeners, who destroyed Jerusalem?
The Romans.
The Romans, and then they were referred to as? The enemies of God thereafter. It became common to refer to them as the Babylons.
Okay.
Yeah, so
Rome is referred to as Babylon in the New Testament. I'm not sure if I think that's probably before the destruction, but maybe after too.
Okay, because the issue of the authorship of Simon is now in question. Because Simon refers also to the Romans. Simon Peter also refers to the Romans as Babylon.
Yes.
However, this term, the Simon died in 64. The event which took place that eventually ended or resulted up in Rome being called Babylon occurred after his death in the year 70. So why is Simon there referring to Rome as Babylon, even though that event that caused them to be referred to as the enemy of God happened after his death? This is some of the reason why the scholars don't believe that Simon Peter is the author of this book.
And that's good to know. I mean, I'm aware broadly of some of these arguments. To be honest, eschatology is never something I've specialised in, nor, to be honest, the Pauline epistles. I generally focus, more on the Gospels than I do on Paul. But anyway, to proceed, you could read it that way, or you could say, well, actually, it turns out that 1 Peter, 2 Peter, whichever one refers to Rome as Babylon, itself now becomes evidence that Rome was called thus prior to AD 70. I'm just trying to think back to the Qumran description, because they, unless I'm mistaken, they used, it was either the Babylonians or other ancient enemies of God, and they applied that description to Rome. So that link was made before. And actually, in terms of Peter in particular, Peter is generally believed to have suffered in the Neronian persecution, which happens, early 60s. So actually, that would be a very good time to start calling Rome Babylon. So I'd say pre-70 is still a very plausible circumstance in which to call Rome Babylon.
Because generally, they say at the end of the 1st century. Now, if the act which caused them to call Rome Babylon occurred in 70. How is Peter, this is what the question is, how is he referring to Rome as Babylon, even though this term didn't get used until the end of the 1st century?
I do think I've just addressed that in two ways. One is by saying actually Peter himself could be taken as evidence that what you just said isn't true. It's not just at the end of the 1st century, but actually it turns out as early as the 60s is this happening. And I gave other evidence that, the Dead Sea Scrolls, I think they may make that Babylonian translation. So I'm challenging your narrative that it's not until AD 70 that this connection is made. I dispute that narrative.
Okay, great. Another book which is Pauline, Colossians. Okay, now if you do analysis of the actual writing, Paul, he tends to write short sentences which are simple. Now this gospel, we see something peculiar. We see sentences which are over 50 words long, which are very complex and complicated. Thereafter, certain scholars, including other books such as Philippians, Galatians, Ephesians, they say that Philippians is over 102 sentences, and only one of those sentences is over 50 words. Galatians is 181 sentences with only one sentence over 50 words. Now, Ephesians is long and complex. In 100 sentences, there are only 9 sentences, there are 9, which is a lot compared to the others in 100 sentences that reach over 50 words. For this reason, the scholars don't believe that Paul was an author because it doesn't match his literary style. What would you respond to that?
So I think that's a good point. I'd have two broad responses. One is, so there certainly is merit to this approach as part of a cumulative approach where all facts are taken into consideration. It has, studies have been done where they found, either within the accepted Pauline canon or other ancient works of literature, where they compare amongst the accepted works, and actually they find these kind of stylistic discrepancies. So it's not unknown for authors to make these kind of changes in their writing style within their works. It could be, with time, people's writing styles change. Mine has changed over time. It can be based on the topic that they're discussing.
Are you saying
so Ephesians, for example, it's got a lot about, unless I'm mistaken, because I'm quite hazy in my Pauline studies, I think Ephesians has a lot about the heavenly powers and being victorious, and when you're celebrating you get carried away, and that could be why he writes such long sentences. I would also refer to the work of Randolph Richards, who talks a lot about scribes and amanuenses. And of course, if you're using a scribe, that's going to massively change the writing style. So I think the combination of scribes and the natural alteration that writers have in their own writing styles could perhaps account for this. I can't say for sure. I've not studied it enough in the Greek to comment.
Yeah, excellent. I really appreciate your honesty, and none of us are scholars, and we're not walking encyclopedias, so I do not want anyone to walk away and think that.
Just if anyone wants, I think Randolph Richards' book is something like first century scribal practices or something like that. Google it, you'll find, or Paul letter writer, something like that.
So there's other books outside the Pauline literature which also are doubtful. For example, the Gospels that we have, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John. Now I think this is the next part of our discussion. Books which may have been written by other people, which are non-Pauline. Would you say all of these 4 Gospels are written by the authors themselves?
So I wouldn't argue it with certainty. So I wouldn't place too much weight upon that point. But yes, I would tend to go with the traditional inscriptions. I think,
I should have completed the point that I was making. One of these Gospels refer to the author in third person, or the alleged author in third person. It speaks about John, for example, as a beloved to Jesus, and that's John, and it speaks of it in third person. You also have this in Matthew, and the other Gospels are written in third person. Generally, when we tend to write, and I understand we may expand on the grammar here, that when we tend to write, we don't write about ourselves in third person. So how would you describe to those scholars who argue that these authors are not the actual authors of the Gospel?
I think it depends what kind of writing you're doing. If I'm writing you a letter about my day, I'm going to refer to I. If I'm writing a more detached, authoritative account, for example, the company I work for, if I'm writing an account, I will say, Richard then opened the panel discussion. At that point, because this is now something I'm writing on behalf of the organisation, it is no longer appropriate for me to refer to I will refer to myself in the third person. Likewise with the Gospels. The Gospels aren't about the authors. They are a form of authoritative writing for the church about the person of Jesus Christ. And I find it very conceivable in those scenarios that they may well refer to themselves in the third person. A classic example is, I think it might be Josephus, is one of the classic examples they always give. Writing history, speaks of Josephus. He doesn't say I, he says Josephus. That would be one example. I think there may be others.
If we could just now jump to the Old Testament. Yep. Now, we had this discussion before in regards to the first 5 books which are generally attributed to Moses.
Traditionally, yes.
Traditionally. I think the scholarship has moved away from that.
Most scholars, yes.
Most scholars, yeah. So now I think they're talking about more than 4 different authors. One of the contentious lines that can be found in the last of those 5 books is where it says Moses, and it speaks of Moses in third person. Moses died, describes his death, which shows that he cannot be the one who's writing. It says Moses died in the land of Moab. Now, many Christians still tend to think that Moses had written these books. Could you please expand on that?
Yeah, so I mean, it's very easy to imagine that Moses could have written the vast majority. Moses then dies, and a scribe following after him adds in the section which obviously he could not write about his death, which is, unless I'm mistaken, the very last section. So it's quite conceivable that Moses could have written 98% of it, and someone, a scribe, we would say under the inspiration of God, add that.
Is there any evidence?
It's also theoretically possible that under the inspiration of God he could write prophetically about the future, but most evangelicals don't feel the need to go down that route.
But would you think, for example, do you think Moses actually, you said that you think Moses wrote the 98%. What evidence would you say that suggests that Moses wrote that much?
So evangelicals will often say that. I do sometimes disagree with other evangelicals, we're not homogenous. I am undecided as to who wrote
Okay, that's good.
I'm not, especially because I'm not an Old Testament scholar.
Because scholars generally tend to break it down into 4 authors.
Sure, at least 4 JDP, yes.
So generally we spoke about.
There are exceptions. And actually, I think the JDP theory. I mean, I'm very hazy on all this. I don't do Old Testament. I think there's been a bit of a move away from that, even amongst non-evangelicals, which isn't to say they're now saying Moses wrote it, but I'm saying that the fourfold division, I think, has come under attack. If you want a good non-evangelical critique of the JDP theory, the making of the Pentateuch by Wyray, W-H-Y-B-R-A-Y, he thinks, he disagrees with JDP. I think he may say it's one author. Now, he dates it very late. I think he says it's exilic or something, during the time of the exile, so not Moses. But I think he attacks a lot of the arguments for separate JDP authors.
Now we can go on about the authorship of certain books for a long period of time. I do want to kind of draw some kind of conclusion. So we've made mention of many books which are Pauline, non-Pauline in the New Testament, as well as the Old Testament. Now the question is, if our theology is derived from these books which we don't know the authorship of, how can we have with any form of certainty? In fact, it would have to be very low confidence. So how then can we derive concepts of Trinity or concepts which stray from normative Abrahamic beliefs of one God in Unitarian kind of concept? How would you then justify that? Because the text itself is unknown. We don't know who wrote it, and at the same time we're saying that these men are inspired. Yeah. Would you say that in itself is a strong kind of question to ask a Christian?
Yes, I mean, from your perspective, from a non-Christian perspective, that is a very good challenge to make. Yes, I do disagree with the statement. I disagree with the idea that the Old Testament is Unitarian. I don't think it is. I'd be happy to discuss that with you. I think the Old Testament hints at the plurality of God. It predicts the divinity of the Messiah. So I actually think part of the reason I believe in the Trinity is because of the Old Testament. So I think that actually, so even if authorship is dubious, I think that actually helps my case rather than weakens it. But in terms of the authorship, I mean, I would say that yes, there are real challenges with that. I would still say there is sufficiently good evidence to believe in the traditional authorship, but I don't throw all my eggs in that basket. I guess I approach it in a different way. I say, do I have evidence to believe Jesus died and rose again? Yes, I believe I do. Historically, just treating these as historical documents.
That he rose again or he died?
Both. Or both. He died and he rose again. We can come to that later. I know Muslims will disagree on the death of Jesus. Part two, absolutely. Following that, he is now, the one that I'm going to listen to. This makes me a Christian. This makes me say, what should I believe as a Christian? And then I look historically at, even if Matthew didn't write Matthew, Mark didn't write Mark, etc., I still say, from all the historical studies I've done, do these documents reflect the earliest statements about the historical Jesus and about what the early Christians believed? Did Paul, who yes, he didn't put no the earth in Jesus, but he was approved of by the other disciples who knew Jesus, what did he teach about Jesus? And so through these kind of historical chains, it gives me good reason to believe in the doctrines of the New Testament. And also the doctrine of canonicity. We talked before about the canon. I hope it came across there. I'm not an expert in that. It is a grey area, but broadly speaking, for me, I think it has the material from the apostles. It had that accepted within the church. If God sent Jesus, he died, he rose again, I would expect God to preserve true revelation about him. I experienced in my own life the spiritually life-transforming power and beauty and amazing message of Scripture. All of these factors make me together a believer in the New Testament.
Do you think that perhaps you're more socialized into Christianity and its beliefs rather than evidentially persuaded by the arguments? As in, could you see from the point of the non-Christians why you have a theology such as Trinity or the triune of God, which sways far from the other Abrahamic faiths, and then the evidence for that is very dubious because we don't know the authorship? And isn't it self-defeating if you say the prophecy argument?
Yeah. So false prophecies that didn't come true would of course be an issue. In terms of the eschatology, I said I'm not an expert, I've looked into this before. The position that I came to from my studies was preterism, which I've described, which is a lot of them refer to AD 70, they were fulfilled then. Other ones refer to the final day of judgment, like in Islam, and therefore we would expect those ones not to be yet fulfilled. So they haven't been disproven, those ones, they just haven't happened yet. Both Muslims and Christians are still waiting for that final day. So you would have to disprove to me preterism, which is a much bigger conversation. In terms of the other point you make about Emmanuel, first of all, it's quite possible some Christians during his lifetime, did call him that. We don't know everything he was called. Secondly, actually Christians since the New Testament, or maybe even elsewhere in the New Testament, have called him Emmanuel, so that did kind of come true. But also, in the Old Testament, I think it's being maybe a bit wooden to say he wasn't literally called this. What is the point of Emmanuel? What does it mean? It means God with us. Do Christians believe Jesus to be God with us? Yes, we do believe that. So actually, it is true that we do.
Well, could you just explain?
But also, very finally, I don't normally appeal to Isaiah 7:14 anyway. Myself and many evangelicals believe the immediate application to this is in the time of the prophet Isaiah. Different possibilities. Is it the son of the king? I don't know, Ahaz or whichever king it was. Is it the son of the prophet Isaiah? A few options. So I would say the immediate application isn't Jesus. Is there a secondary fulfillment typology in Jesus? Yes, I would say that there is, especially when taken in light of Isaiah 9, Isaiah 11, and later parts of Isaiah. So basically what I'm saying is, because of the typological approach I take to Isaiah 7:14, it's probably not one you want to focus on. I'd say challenge me on a different one.
I think generally we've spoken about a lot of things, and perhaps for today we should leave it.
Okay.
And I'm happy to discuss the next step, which is this issue here, as in what stopped you from being Muslim, and we can discuss all of these issues in the next standing or discussion that we have. How about that?
That sounds great.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you.